right, welcome Facebook. Glad you are here with us. This is Mike Davis here. We are live from the Oasis, our online fellowship. So glad you can join us here on Facebook, along with the people that you don't see, but they're here in our Zoom room, members of our fellowship, the Oasis. We are going to pray, and we're going to get into our study for today. Father, we thank you in Jesus' name for your word, for your spirit of truth, your word of truth. We ask you that you lead us and guide us. We ask you, Lord, that you use your word to prune us, to take away everything that prevents us from being fruitful to your glory. And we just thank you for showing us your ways and teaching us your paths. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Okay, so we are back talking about and doing our recap called, So What Have We Learned? Highlighting key findings and learnings. We are in message number 3. This will be the last message for this recap. And let me say this, when I said that we were doing a recap and finishing up this portion of Who's the Boss, Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context, some people thought that it meant that the series was over. What's over is our Old Testament study of this series. So what we're going to be doing next is going into the New Testament and looking at these, looking at the egalitarian and complementarian debate or discussion from the New Testament perspective. It is in, when we get in, we're going to be dealing with some of the what some people call the problem passages. Some people refer to them as the clobber passages, where women are concerned. We're going to be looking at several different things, the passages that deal with submission. We're going to be looking at the passages that talk about, I suffer not a woman to teach nor to usurp authority over a man. We're going to be talking about that. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. There's a lot to cover in the New Testament portion of this series. But here we are recapping what we have learned as we've gone through the Hebrew scriptures, or the Old Testament. I like to call it the Tanakh. We've been talking about what we've learned and what have been the key findings, what have been some of the high or the key learning points that we've discussed here. So we're on message number 3. We've covered 6 so far. I've got 3 more for you today, and then we'll close out. So, and by the way, as I said before, this recap, if you've got friends who are interested in this series, but they don't want to go through the first 37 messages, because they're all 37 messages, and with these messages, there's 40. They don't want to go through the first 37. This is a nice little recap that they can cover about an hour at a time through each session. Okay, so open your Bible up to Hebrews chapter 11. As we go into the next portion here, and here we're going to look at another key learning. This is number 7. So another lesson that we've looked at, that we've learned, has to do with the use of 2 passages, 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 and 32, which we're going to read now. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 and 32 says, "By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens, women received their dead, raised to life again." I read a little bit more than verse 32, but verse 32 says, what more? Verse 31 talks about Rahab, and then it mentions Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Now, there are those who, and this is kind of a minor point, but I heard it being used, so I taught on it. There are those who use these passages and the parallel passage in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, Samuel, as he is getting ready to tell Israel who their king is going to be, Israel has said, they came to Samuel and said, we no longer want judges to rule over us, as had been God's way up to that point. They said, we want a king like the other nations. We no longer want judges. The judges were God's preferred way by which he ruled over Israel as their king. They said, we want a human king to be our judge. And God told Samuel, do as the people have said. They have not rejected you, they've rejected me. But give them a king, tell them what's going to happen when they have a king. So Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, he talks about how God brought deliverance through the judges, and he names himself and other people. He named Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 parallels 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11. There are those who use these 2 passages to say that it is Barak and not Deborah who's mentioned. And it is true in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, Barak is named. There's another name they give, but most scholars agree that he's talking about Barak. And also, so Barak is mentioned. Barak is mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 11, in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, Barak is mentioned. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, Barak is mentioned and Deborah is not mentioned. So there are those in the complementarian camp who say, well, the fact that God mentions Barak and not Deborah proves that it was a man all along that God chose to be the leader, not a woman. So that it was really Barak that God had chosen, not Deborah, because it's Barak that's mentioned, not Deborah. They said that Deborah was, Deborah functioned as a help. She was a, she fulfilled that role where God says, when God says, when he created the woman, she should be a help meet for him. So they were saying Deborah was a help. She was an encourager. She assisted him, but in a subordinate way. She wasn't the leader. She was acting as an assistant and an encourager. Basically, she was fulfilling the role that God gave to women. It is the man who was the lead. It is the woman who was supposed to submit to and encourage that lead. So there are those who use 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 and 32 to prove this complementarian point. And they said the fact that that Deborah is not mentioned and that Jael is not mentioned proves that it was a man that God chose, not a woman, which goes to the complementarian point. It is men, in other words, or it affirms, it supports and upholds the complementary position, or what I call the patriarchal principle, which is the patriarchal principle is that men are the ones who are supposed to lead. They are created to lead. Women are created to submit to the lead of men, and they are to follow the lead of men, and women are never to lead men. So from a complementarian point of view, by saying that, well, listen, it is Barak in 1 Corinthians 12 who is mentioned. It's Barak in Hebrews chapter 11 that's mentioned. Deborah is nowhere mentioned. So this proves that God chose men to be the leader and not a woman. So in the book of Judges, when we see Deborah, but the fact that Deborah's not mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 12, Hebrews chapter 11, this really shows that it's not Deborah who's the leader. It is Barak who's the leader. Deborah is his assistant. She encourages him. She supports him. But it is Barak who is the leader. So this upholds their complementarian position. Well, when we studied this is what I said. There are these three things I brought out. Number one is that we're not told specifically or at all in the Bible why Deborah or Jael are not mentioned. We're not told why they're not mentioned. Number two, we are given no reason why Barak is mentioned instead of Deborah. We're not told why Barak is mentioned instead of Deborah. There is no explicit verse of scripture. So we're never told that Barak is mentioned and Deborah is not mentioned because this shows that God proves that men are to be in the lead and not the woman. We're not told that. The scripture doesn't say that. And number three, I said we should not make too much of the fact that Deborah is not mentioned in Barak for the reasons I just cited. And also because when you look at Hebrews chapter 11, there are a lot of biblical heroes, men who are not mentioned. Okay, to give you a quick example, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 says, by faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she received the spies with peace. Rahab is mentioned in the book of Joshua. You know who is not mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11? Joshua. Joshua himself is not mentioned. Rahab from the book is mentioned. Joshua is not. So should we therefore infer that because Rahab is mentioned from the book of Joshua and Joshua himself is not mentioned, should we infer from that the true leader and champion of the book of Joshua is Rahab and not Joshua, because it is Rahab that is mentioned and not Joshua? So Rahab is the true leader? That would be wrong, okay? That would be a misuse of the scripture. We cannot infer that because Joshua is not mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 and Rahab is, that therefore this says something about the superiority of Rahab over Joshua. That just doesn't work, okay? Now, I offered some possible, and I emphasized the word possible, and when I taught it, I said even plausible reason, a plausible reason for why Deborah and not Jael are not mentioned and why Barak is mentioned instead. Now, again, this is possible. And I have to say that any reason that we give is speculation. Okay, any reasons that we give, even saying that, well, the reason that Barak is mentioned and not Deborah's because God wanted to show that it's men who are in charge. That's pure speculation. It's speculation, all right? But I gave him reason, and I just want to say again that it is speculation. Even when I'm getting ready to share, it's a possible reason. I believe there's some plausibility to it. So in sharing this, though, I want to say that I'm not saying this is 100% dogmatically, this is why. It's a possible, plausible, in my thinking, reason. And what I suggested was that the reason Deborah and Jael are not mentioned and Barak is mentioned, that it has to do with honor. It has to do with the subject of honor. Remember, we said before, you can go back and listen to the whole message to get this, but honor was one of the most important biblical values. It is one of the most important pivotal values of the ancient world, of the Greco-Roman first century world that Jesus lived in, the Jewish world that Jesus lived in, and also in ancient Israel, honor was extremely important. This is an extremely important value in the ancient world. And I suggested that 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11, that when Samuel is talking about these different leaders, that he is protecting and upholding the honor of the office of the judge. That office of the judge was going to end with him, because the people in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 through 5, they rejected the office of the judge. Okay, they rejected it, and they rejected it because of how Samuel's sons were functioning. They were corrupt. His sons were corrupt. His sons were dishonorable through their behavior. So the people came to Samuel and said, listen, your sons are not like you. We want to end this office of the judge. We want a king like all of the other nations. Now, keep in mind that it is God who set up the office of the judge. And it appears when you read the text, when God talks to Samuel about this, God is not too happy with the choices that the people make, yet he allows it. Samuel, though, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, 1 Samuel chapter 12, he is at pains to protect his own honor, which would have been in danger because of his sons. His sons had acted in dishonorable ways, which would reflect back upon the father. Children are supposed to protect the honor of the family. Samuel has been an honorable man, and he makes sure that the people see him as an honorable man. You can go back and read this. But what he's doing in 1 Samuel chapter 12 is showing and proving that despite the rejection of the office of the judge by the people of Israel, that he, as a judge, and others who were honored by and others who were judges, that they were honored by God. Even though the people are seeing the office as not being honorable and they're rejecting it, I believe he is demonstrating and proposing and saying to them, listen, this was an honorable position. It's almost like he's saying, this is Mike's rendition. Don't get it twisted. I know that my sons were dishonorable, but don't get it twisted. This was an honorable position. Remember, honor is extremely important. By rejecting the office, the people could be impugning the honor of Samuel and the honor of the judges who came by. So what Samuel does is that he demonstrates that he, and as well as the other judges, that is the office of judge itself, that they were honored by God. How were they honored by God? Through the victories that they achieved through the power of God, which was working through their faithfulness to the will of God. So as these judges achieved victory, he talks about how God wrought deliverances through these judges. This is known as achieved honor. You would get honor through achievement. You would get honor through military battles. One of the ways you could achieve honor. So these people were honored by God. Samuel, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. They all, and later on in Hebrews chapter 11 talks about David, but they all achieved victory. He talked about Moses and Aaron. They achieved victory over their enemies, and that would bring them honor, and it was an honor bestowed upon them, and it also showed that God was with them, which also would bring them honor. So Samuel, I believe, was trying to show, listen, this is an honorable office. Now, why does he mention, though, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David? And my reason for this, my position on this, is that the people who are mentioned are all people that was mentioned by Samuel whose honor was questionable, whose honor could be brought into question. So Gideon, later on, Gideon's sons and Gideon himself, they did some things that were sketchy that brought their honor into question. Jephthah was known as a dishonorable man. There are those who could have looked upon Barak as being dishonorable because of his association with Deborah, because that Jael was the one who killed Sisera. So there were those who could possibly look upon him as being dishonorable. And the point that I was making was, even though there, and by the way, Samuel himself, his honor was brought into question. And if you go and read 1 Samuel chapter 8 and 1 Samuel chapter, I believe it's chapter 12, he really establishes his honor. He establishes that he says, have I taken anything from you? Have I stolen? Have I been perverse in my justice? And they go, no, you have not. His sons were, but he says, no, you have not. And he says, from the day that I was first presented to you, I've served God faithfully, I've served you faithfully. And all the people said, amen. This was an establishment of his honor. So all of these people that he mentioned, though, including himself, these were people whose honor could be brought into question because of certain things that they said and did. I mean, Samuel, I keep saying Samuel, Gideon, Barak, Samson, definitely his honor before the people could be brought into question. But what Samuel does is basically saying, hey, look at these people whose honor could be brought into question. We know that they were honored by God being with them, which is demonstrated in the victories which they achieved. And their victories that they achieved would give them what's known as achieved honor. So these are honorable people. Therefore, this office was honorable. So make no mistake, as I like to say, to put it in my vernacular of the day, don't get it twisted. This was an honorable office. You may be rejecting it, but this was an office of honor. So he's upholding and maintaining the honor of the office of judge, which was rejected by the people. He does this by citing the achievements or the deliverances of the judges, which would give them honor. This would also show, or I should say that by upholding the honor and the office of the judge would also show that God was with him. Again, that would bestow honor upon the office. And also he's upholding the honor of God, because it is God, because the honor of God would be impugned because God was rejected as king by the people. So he's upholding the honor of the office, the honor which was bestowed upon them by God. He's upholding the honor of God. So this is why I say this is about, in my opinion, honor. And he's upholding the honor of these people that he mentions whose honor could be questioned or questionable, could be brought into question, okay? Or they could face being shamed. And he says, no, even though you're rejecting the office, the office was honorable, and all the people who were served they were given or bestowed honor by God, by him being with them, which is demonstrated by him giving them victory. Okay, now so that's 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 11. When we get over to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 and 32, the author of Hebrews is also making use of these characters, same characters that Samuel used. He's making use of these characters to encourage the audience that he is writing to. The audience that he is writing to is being dishonored, and they are being shamed through persecution because of their faith in Christ. They are tempted to abandon Christ. They are tempted to abandon their faith, their loyalty, their allegiance to Christ. And the reason they're tempted to do this is because their honor has now been brought into question, or more specifically, they have been shamed publicly. Their honor has been taken away from them by the persecutions which they have endured. So the author of Hebrews is writing to them and giving them examples of people who, because of their faithfulness to God, achieved honor. Honor was given to them. So one of the things that the author of Hebrew does is he shares with them heroes of the faith, respected characters whose honor was brought into question, or whose honor was questionable. Who are these people? Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David. David's honor. By the way, one of the reasons I believe this is so is because he starts off this list with Rahab, and he specifically says in verse 31, by faith, the harlot Rahab. He doesn't just say Rahab, he specifically mentions, hey, this is a harlot. So what this author, I believe, is doing with these characters is showing these are all people whose honor, if you look at the biblical text, their honor was questionable, yet these are people who received honor from God. Technically speaking, they could be put into the category of shame because of actions and behaviors, because of the occupation in which they were in. Rahab was a harlot. That would not bring honor, that would bring shame. But what he goes on to say is that these characters, even though their honor could be questioned, they were nevertheless, or look like this, in the eyes of men, they may not have been honorable because of certain things. Nevertheless, they achieved honor from God, not from man, because of their faithfulness to God, because of their faith in or faithfulness to God. They were able to achieve honor, even though their honor was brought into question. We see this in verse 35. You look in verse 35, it says, women received their dead raised to life again. Let's go back up to verse 32. Well, let's go back up to verse 31. We'll start there with Rahab. By faith, the heart of Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith, now notice these things that they did through faith, subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Now, these are all things that they did by faith. These are what this would bring to them or bestow upon them achieved honor. Okay. Others, now, so here are all the great things they did. Then it says, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might attain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourging, yes, and of chains and imprisonments. They were stoned, they were sown in two. They were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts, mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. Now, what this tells us from verse 35 or verse 31 to 39, it shares not only those who achieved great victories through their faith, but also those who were persecuted because of their faith or faithfulness or loyalty or allegiance to God. And we are told, and the audience that this is written to, they are told that all of these characters, all of these heroes of faith, whose honor was brought into question, especially those who were stoned and sawn in two, who were tempted, they were tempted and were slain, they were tested or slain with the sword. These people are being persecuted. They are being made to suffer. They are shamed in the eyes of men, because these are ways that you shame people in the ancient world. It says that even though all of this happened, it says these heroes whose honor was brought into question, or better yet to say, their honor was taken away from them. It says they obtained, in the eyes of men, they obtained a good testimony through faith. People who looked at them would have questioned whether or not they had honor. That's why I said their honor was brought into question, because they're being persecuted. They have all these shameful things happen. How can these be honorable people? It says, nevertheless, they obtained a good, I'm reading New King James, they obtained a good testimony through faith. Dr. David De Silva, in his work, says that this phrase was used, quote, when speaking of the endorsement by Roman authorities of a person who a local assembly wishes to honor. Notice this, the words obtain a good testimony, this phrase is used when speaking of the endorsement by Roman authorities of a person who a local assembly wishes to honor. It represented the approval of the authorities that the candidate was worthy of receiving honors. It can refer to the spreading of a good reputation. So the characters mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, from verse 31 all the way down to verse 38, these are people, the characters mentioned, they serve as an example of those whose honor was brought into question, it was suspect, and these are people who occupied a place of shame in the eyes of others, but they achieved honor in the sight of God. So these people that are talked about here in Hebrews chapter 11, in the eyes of human beings, they might be shamed, but in the eyes of God, who is the authority, they obtain a good report. They obtain a good testimony. God was honoring them. They had honor from God because of their faithfulness. So what brought the honor was not the results, in other words, victorious achievements, overcoming. That by itself is not really what gave the honor from, or what brought honor from God. What brought honor from God was the faithfulness, not necessarily the results that people would deem, like most people back then would say, oh yeah, military victories, overcoming lions. Yes, that brings you that caused you to be looked upon as a successful, prosperous, overcoming person. That brings you honor from God. He also mentioned those who were tested, who were tried, who were stoned, things that would bring dishonor. And they said, and the author of Hebrews says, no, they too receive honor from God because of their faithfulness. All right. So to bring this all together, these people that were mentioned, Jephthah, Gideon, Samson, Barak, as well as those who were stoned and tempted, they all served as an encouragement to those who were persecuted, who were shamed, and who were without honor. Okay, they fit the criteria. What was the author of Hebrews? Who was he communicating to? He was communicating to people who were being stripped of their honor according to man's system of honor. So he cites people that according to man's system of honor, their honor could be brought into question. And he shows that even though these people had things attached to them that could bring them into dishonor, they received honor from God because of their faithfulness. And right now, I mean, he's talking to the people that he's writing to, or whoever wrote this article, whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, the writer is saying, and listen, you're in the same position. Some of you are now in a position where you are being dishonored by men and you're looked upon as being shamed in the eyes of men. But if you stay faithful to God, you also will receive honor. It was an encouragement. So he used people whose honor were questionable or brought into question, people who could be shamed in the eyes of men. He used it to speak to people who were being shamed in the eyes of men at his time to encourage them. Now, the reason Deborah and Jael would not be mentioned is because they did not fit the criteria of the author for characters whose honor was questioned. Remember what I said before, people like Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, these are all people whose honor could be questioned because of things that happened. Deborah and Jael had nothing happen that would bring their honor into question. When you read their story, they are consistently showed as being honorable throughout, especially Deborah. There is nothing in Deborah's story that taints her character, unlike the other judges in the book of Judges. Deborah is clean, basically. She is honorable throughout, from beginning to end. But what the author of Hebrews, I am proposing, what the author of Hebrews needed were characters whose honor could be brought into question, who would be seen as shameful in the eyes of the people. You look at Deborah, you look at Jael, they wouldn't fit that criteria. But you look at Gideon, you look at Barak, you look at Samson and Jephthah, David and Samuel, even though they had things attached to them and to their life that could do away with their honor because of their faithfulness to God. And that's the emphasis, is not the results necessarily they produce, but their faithfulness to God that brought them honor in the eyes of God. So the author of Hebrews is saying, so be encouraged, those of you that are being shamed before men. If you remain faithful to God, you are honored by the highest authority there is, and that is God himself. So this is why, in my opinion, Deborah and Jael were not mentioned, because they did nothing that caused their honor to be brought into question. They didn't do anything that caused them to be shamed. So this was, in my possible, and I would say plausible scenario, this was about honor, not about God showing that he preferred and picked a man to be the leader and not a woman. He wasn't trying to show, well, I picked Barak because really I wanted a man to be in charge and not a woman. It wasn't about that. It was about honor. That's why Deborah and Jael were not mentioned, not because they weren't honorable. It wasn't, you could say, it's because they were thoroughly honorable. There was nothing about their story that brought shame. But in the other people that are mentioned, every single one, Rahab was a harlot. Gideon's family actually erected what it looks like to be an idol. Barak, he could have been, his honor could be questioned because and even though I don't believe that this was done to shame him, but it could be brought into question in the eyes of people that a woman got the victory or a woman killed Sisera and not him. Samson, his life had many things wrong with it. Jephthah started off, it talks about him running around with disreputable men, and the way that his story ends could be seen as being dishonorable. David sleeping with Bathsheba. David did some other things that could be seen as dishonorable. And then Samuel himself necessarily did not do anything. However, his sons did something that caused the office of the judge to be rejected by the people and replaced with a monarchy. Okay, so all of these people could have had something that could have been said, what you call their honor into question. And what the author of Hebrews, I believe, is saying, even though their honor might be called into question, and even though we got people who are tortured because of their faith, guess what? That doesn't mean that they are shameful people. In the eyes of men, they might be, but in the eyes of God, they are honorable. So that's why Deborah and Jael is not mentioned, because they didn't do anything that would bring their honor into disrepute or cause their honor to be questioned. All right, so that's one of the things we learned. That was number 7. All right, just a recap. You go back, you can find the messages. I think I did 2 messages to cover all of that. That was just a short little recap. The 8th key finding and learning that we saw was that women being excluded from the priesthood of Israel does not show or prove that God chose men and not women to be the leaders. This is one of the points that complementarians make. They say, look, when we look, this is why women can't be pastors, because when we look at Israel, who are the ones who are the teachers? It is the Levites. They are the teaching priest of Israel. They teach Israel the Torah, the law. Though it's interesting that, later on in Jesus' day, it's not just the priests that are teaching, it's the Pharisees who teach also. And they're looked upon as authorities of the Torah. We'll get to that when we get to the New Testament. Anyway, but in ancient Israel and during the monarchical period, it is the priests who are picked by God to serve him, the Levitical priesthood. So the tribe of Levi, they are the priesthood. The sons of Aaron serve before God. And so what I think most complementarians take that to say, see, God chose men to teach the Torah. So men are to teach, they are to lead. This proves that women, because no women were allowed to be priests, only men. So this shows a theme of God that he's picking men to be a leader. Once again, we have to say this: the biblical text does not tell us specifically why women were excluded. We are not told specifically why women were excluded. So once again, any reasons we give, even if we're giving it from the egalitarian side, any reasons we give, which I'm going to give some reasons, any reasons we give are speculation at best, because the text does not definitively tell us. It does not explicitly and specifically tell us why women were excluded from the priesthood. In other words, there's no verse that says, and this is why women can't be priests. There's no verse that says that. So anybody who tells you, well, this is the reason why, it's speculation, okay? There are those in the complementarian camp, again, who believe that this shows a pattern of God, that God chooses men to be in the position of leadership. The problem with this is they use as the criteria the fact that only males, this is how they explain it, only males of the species, only men are allowed to be priests. So this gives support to their belief that men are to be the leaders because only male priests were chosen. The problem, as I said before, is this is narrowing the scope of the criteria that's used in the book of Leviticus. It leaves out other criteria. It just uses it, and it selects one narrow criteria. The male of the species were chosen, males among the Israelites were chosen, but it leaves out the other criteria. And so it narrows it and it leaves out others. It wasn't just women who were excluded. Any male who was not of the tribe of Levi was excluded. Any male outside of the tribe of Levi was excluded. So only males within the tribe of Levi were to be could serve God as a priest. So somebody might say, well, Mike, still though, that shows that only men, it's just men of the tribe of Levi. Well, here's another one. Even if you were from the priestly tribe, if you were of the tribe of Levi, you could not serve if you had certain blemishes or defects. That is, if you were not physically whole or complete, even if you were from the tribe of Levi, you still could not serve. So that's another criteria that's brought in that is often not talked about in terms of when I survey the literature. I don't see them saying, well, listen, women can't serve because one of our points for men only in leadership is that we look at the tribe of Levi. When we look in the Old Testament, we see only male priests being chosen. So only men, we could take that principle to the New Testament and say only men can be in charge. Only men are to lead. To which I would say, well, wait a minute now. If you were a male and you had blemishes or defects, if there's something wrong with your eyes, if there's some type of defect in your body, even if you were the tribe of Levi, you still couldn't serve. So that's another criteria point. We would have to bring that over and say, so if you are a man today and you are wanting to be in a position of leadership, if we're going to use the Levites, if we're going to use the priestly class, as an example as to why people can't be in leadership, we would have to say, if you wear glasses like I do, if you have any type of physical deformity or physical defect, if you have any type of physical disablement, if you are not perfectly whole physically, you can't be in positions of leadership. Because that's part of the criteria of the leadership in Israel for the priestly class. If we take that, that's why I said, let's widen the criteria. Let's use all the criteria that's used. Now, let's not narrow the scope to just men. So that would mean any pastor, any theologian, anyone who's serving in the church, if you wear glasses, if you got any type of eczema, is it eczema? Any type of skin blemish, we'll call it that, okay? If you've got anything like that, if you are paralyzed, if you're in a wheelchair, if you are not physically complete and whole, you can't be in a position of leadership in the church today because that was part of the criteria back then. Nobody says this. Nobody used this. I don't believe that. I don't believe that's God's will. And we talked about last time why it was looked upon that way, because it has to do with what it represented. But that is not the criteria for the day. And nobody uses that criteria. I've heard no one in the complementarian camp use that as a criteria, but it was part of the criteria back then. So my argument is, if you're going to use that as a criteria back then, why are we not going to use that as a criteria now? If you're going to use the criteria of males only being picked to exclude women, you have to use the rest of the criteria to exclude men who have physical defects. No one does that. If we remember, one of the rules for interpretation that I talked about at the very beginning of this series is consistency. We need to be consistent in how we are going to interpret the text. Okay, and that's not being consistent. That's narrowing the scope. It's cherry picking one criteria because it fits our position, but it's not expanding it and utilizing all of the criteria. And I'm saying, if we're going to be consistent, let's use all the criteria. Again, this is often left out of the complementarian argument. All right, here's another one too. Gentile men would be disqualified because only Jews of the tribe of Levi, or only Israelites of the tribe of Levi could serve as priests. So Gentiles were excluded from the priesthood. That would mean Gentiles today could not be leaders today. So like, oh, well, come on, Mike. You know, Gentiles were are part of the church today. Well, yeah, Gentiles who were part of the people of Israel, especially if you go back and read it, there were Gentiles, Egyptians who came among them. They were excluded from the priesthood. So if Gentiles back then were excluded from the priesthood, that would mean Gentiles today, Gentile men, would be excluded from leadership if we are being consistent in all of the criteria that is being used. Could Gentiles back in ancient Israel serve as priests? No. Could a Gentile man who was whole and complete, could he serve as a priest? No. Why? He was a Gentile. Well, if that's a criteria for leadership, we would have to come to today and we're in the church age and say, hey, no Gentile can serve because Gentiles couldn't serve back then either. Again, this was part of the criteria. And my argument is, if you're going to use one, yes, let's use them all. And when we start to use them all, we begin to see that the argument really falls apart. The argument cannot stand. So women being excluded because of their gender, and to show that God wanted mentally, that just doesn't work when we expand and use all of the criteria that was being used at the time. When we use all of it, that argument just doesn't work, that women were excluded because of their gender, and it was because God wanted to show that only men are to lead. Now, we looked at possible reasons why women might have been excluded from the priesthood. Possible reasons, not the reasons, possible reasons. Reason number one, God did not want to give the appearance that he was married to a human, either ritually or symbolically, because this is what the Gentile nations did. Female priestesses were seen as married to the deity. God did not want that falsely represented to Israel or to the world, that he was married to a human being as his wife. Okay. Number two, God did not want the world or Israel to think that he had a female consort, that he was married to a female goddess. Again, priestess could represent this. They could represent a female goddess, and that because you had a female priestess, this would mean, as we talked about this in detail, that God was married to a female deity and that there was a goddess beside him. Well, God says, there is no God beside me. There is no goddess beside me. He is only one. But if you had priestess like the other nations did, it could give the impression that Israel is just like the rest of the nations. They not only have a male deity, they have a female deity, and it is very possible that God was seeking to avoid this. Okay, remember, it says that God is jealous and he is holy. He alone is uniquely Israel's God. Yes, there are other gods that exist, that is, other spirit beings. However, God alone is the God of Israel, and there was to be no type of representation in any way, form, or fashion that any other being was Israel's God. So those are two possible reasons. And other scholars have looked at that. Third possible reason is because of female menstrual cycles and other female discharges, which could put the woman in a state of ritual impurity and thus make her unable to serve in the sacred precincts of the temple. One of the things we know was that to be impure in the presence of the holiness of God was dangerous. It was to bring death if you were ritually impure. And women were in greater danger of being ritually impure than men were. They were in greater danger. There's a scholar by the name of Matthew Thiessen. He talks about in his book, Jesus and the Forces of Death, that the goal of Jewish law was not to exclude women, it was to exclude impurity. Matter of fact, here's the book here. Let me read it to you. We read it before. I just want to read it again because I thought it was such an important point. This is from the book, Jesus and the Forces of Death. He says, he talks about the Jewish law. Let me see where I want to quote from. He said, the Jewish law did not aim to exclude women from cult and society. Rather, its purpose was to exclude ritual impurities, whether suffered by a man or by a woman, from the cult. No woman could be a priest in the Jerusalem temple, so women were indeed excluded from the inner realms of the sanctuary. But so too were all men who were not of priestly descent. So he says that here on page 70 of the book, and then he goes on to say, he said, to use an example from modern healthcare practices, let me see if I want to read something else here. Yeah, he said, to use an example from modern health day practices, we discourage people with weakened immunities from visiting hospitals because they might contract an illness while there. Only the most unsympathetic person would choose to interpret this suggestion as an oppressive restriction. Rather, it is a defensive effort motivated by the desire to protect the people. So the way he talks about this in his book is that the reason women were excluded was not because they were women, it was because of the impurity, and other people were excluded, was because of impurity and discharges from the body. Elizabeth Wayne Goldstein wrote in her doctoral dissertation, which is called Impurity and Gender in the Hebrew Bible, Ideological Intersections in the Book of Leviticus, Ezekiel, and Ezra. She writes this: women are the greatest sources, quote, women are the greatest sources for potential impurity because they have the most potential for bleeding from the genitals. She goes on to say, quote, Leviticus 12 states what the author knows to be obvious, that female bodies have a higher potential for tumah, or ritual impurity, than do the bodies of men. This fact in itself does not inherently imply that the priestly writer considered women less important than men. Rather, the writer is reflecting the reality of human biology, end quote. So Dr. Elizabeth Wayne Goldstein, what she is saying, and to me this made so much more sense, women have a higher potential for impurity. They have a greater potential for tumah, or ritual impurity, than men do because of their discharges. Women, of course, have their monthly cycle, but then it talks about other discharges that they have. And as I share in that message, what you didn't want to have happen, as a matter of fact, let me read to you something from here. Let's see. Okay, let me read this again from Matthew Thiessen's book before I make my statement. He said, the motivation and summary that the priestly writer provides for this set of regulations avers that these rules, the purity rules, make known to the Israelite their impurities so that they do not enter into sacred space in an impure state. If they were to do so, as Leviticus 15:31 makes clear, their impurities would cause their deaths. Thus, God gave Moses and Aaron these detailed instructions in order to protect the Israelites who would inevitably and naturally experience impurity from genital discharges, from inadvertently causing their own deaths by entering into holy space. In light of the protective nature of these priestly laws, one can see that compassion and concern for the preservation of human life is integral to such seemingly restrictive commandments. Now, notice what he said here. God gave Moses and Aaron these detailed instructions in order to protect the Israelites who would inevitably and naturally experience impurity from genital discharges, and to protect them from inadvertently causing their own deaths by entering into holy space. So what I was arguing was that because it would be impossible to schedule with precision a woman's monthly cycle, it would be difficult to, because their cycles may not come at the time when it normally does. It might start earlier, it might start later. What if their cycle started, or what if they had a discharge because there were other discharges other than their monthly cycles that women experience? This is what Goldstein says is just a fact of biology, and the scriptures speak to that. What if it happens while they are in the sanctuary? What if it happens while they're in sacred space? It would inadvertently cause their deaths. Okay, so my point was that it would just be it would be just too complex to try to schedule women. This is what Craig Keener and Linda Belleville also argued. It would just be too complex to try to schedule that in. And you had the thing with once a woman has a child and she is breastfeeding, it is normally said that, well, when a woman is breastfeeding, that she does not have a menstrual cycle. However, it is also known biologically it can happen. So in other words, it was too great of a risk for women. It was too great of a risk. And this is the possible reason why I believe women were excluded from the priesthood. It was for their protection, because as Elizabeth Wayne Goldstein said, they were the greatest sources for potential impurity because of the biological fact of how their bodies function and operated. Not because they were less important, not because God chose men over women. It was simply a biological reality, and it could put them at greater risk. And I argue this is why I believe one of the possible, and again, I'm emphasizing possible reasons why women were excluded. Now, when I taught that lesson, I said in the course of teaching it, I am using information from Jesus and the Forces of Death. And I hope that Dr. Thiessen doesn't have a problem with me utilizing his material. But what I did do before I presented the message, I had written to him and I asked him, okay, I'm going to be using your material in my message. And I explained to him my reasoning, my logical reasoning about why women might be excluded. And I said, based upon what you said, is my reasoning sound? Is it possible? He was kind enough to write me back. It came a few days after I gave the message, and he affirmed it. He says, yes, he said, we have to emphasize it's possible because we don't know why women were excluded. We're not actually told, which is what I said then. I'm saying it now. He said, so as long, and I asked him, can I quote you? And he said, yes, just as long as you emphasize, we don't know if this is the reason. It's a possibility, but we're not saying it is the reason. And of course, I've been saying that all along, but I want you to know that I did talk to the author of the book, or by email, communicated with him by email, and he says, yes, that's possible. Is it the actual reason? We don't know. But is there a possibility? Yes, it could be. So my point again is that the reason, a possible reason why women were excluded from the priesthood has nothing to do with the fact that they are women, and because they're women, they can't serve as leaders. That has nothing to do with it. It was to protect them because they had the greater potential. They were more vulnerable to ritual impurity than the men were. Okay. All right. Moving on from there. So again, if you want to go back, you can go back and listen to that whole series on that. So reason number 9. This is the last one, and this is a key finding, not reason, but it's a key finding. So the number 9 key finding and learning is that the social relationships in ancient Israel may be better thought of as a heterarchy rather than a patriarchy. The relationships, especially between men and women, but among all people, it should be thought of more as a heterarchy rather than a patriarchy. Now, a patriarchy involves a rigid hierarchical structure that does not change, which is basically the idea that we get from the complementarian view, is that God created men to be the leaders, women are to be submitted to that leadership, and they're to follow that leadership, and women are never to be in a position of leadership over men. This is the basic complementarian position, what I call the patriarchal principle. Now, in the context of our study, and it's a rigid system because it doesn't change. In the context of our study, we call this the patriarchal principle. But as we've seen, the idea that men are to lead, women are to submit to and follow that lead, and women are to never be in a position of leadership over men, we see that this is not always the case when we look at the Hebrew scriptures, when we look at the Old Testament. We see that women did operate in positions of leadership, even in ancient Israel, which was a male-dominated society. Carol Mayers, who's one of the people I've been quoting from her book a lot, Rediscovering Eve, that's the book back here, okay, Rediscovering Eve. She suggested that ancient Israel operated more after a hierarchy model, and that this is a better way of thinking about how relationships worked in ancient Israel. Now, in a hierarchical model, gender is not the criteria or determining factor for leadership in a hierarchical model. In a patriarchal model, it is. In a hierarchical model, gender is not the criteria or determining factor for leadership. In a hierarchical model, leadership can be based upon age, knowledge, skill, gifting, and in regards to God's people, it would be based upon also his sovereign call. And it has to do with the age, knowledge, skill, and the call of God in relationship to a situation or circumstance that people are dealing with and facing. So it's not based upon gender, it's based upon age, it's based upon knowledge. In other words, leadership, age, knowledge, skill, gifting, the call of God in relationship to a situation or circumstance. Now, hierarchies still exist even within a hierarchical model, but how men and women function in these hierarchies in relationship to each other, in other words, who leads, who follows, this could change based upon who is best suited for the task, which would include the call of God. This would change based upon the situation or the circumstances that need to be dealt with. So what we are not saying is that in a hierarchical model, hierarchies don't exist, that you don't have some people who are leading and some people who are following and submitting. What we're saying is it's more fluid and it could change based upon the situation, based upon the knowledge and the skills, the giftings, the call of God that is required for a particular situation. Who is in charge might change. We see this within the Bible. So we see that in the book of Judges, normally it is the men who are being called, but we see in the book of Judges, Deborah is called and she is the leader in that she is the judge, she is the leader, the ruler. We see it with Abigail, acting in authority where her family was concerned, where her household was concerned, apart from her husband, Nabal. We see this in the wise woman of Abel Beth Ma'akah, when Joab, a military general, comes to the city to tear the city down in order to get one person. Who meets him at the wall? Is it a man? No, it is a woman, a wise woman, which appears to be a function in the village, or an office or function in the village. And Joab does not seem surprised that a woman is speaking to him, and he negotiates with her. She goes to the people and said, this is what we need to do, and they follow her counsel. She is the leader. She is the representative in that situation. So once again, with a hierarchical model, age, skill, knowledge, wisdom, gifting, calling of God, that can determine, based upon the situation, who should be the leader. Okay, so a hierarchical model can have hierarchies that exist, but they could shift based upon the situation. We saw a great example, a modern day example of this from a book called Switchcraft, not Witchcraft, Switchcraft by Dr. Elaine Fox. It's the hidden power of mental agility. And she gave an example of this, what I consider to be a great example of hierarchy. Let me take a sip of water. I'm going to read to you. We read it in the study that we did on this. I'm going to read it again because I think it's so important. This is a real life situation. And she says, this is from chapter 1. Usually it is pitch black and deafening. The thump, thump, thump of rotor blades in the night air drowns out the sporadic swish of passing missiles. Lurching from side to side, it is impossible for the women and men crammed into the tiny space in the back to know how far the helicopter is from the ground, or even how far they are from their destination. 2 minutes, comes the call. Every member of the team then becomes absorbed in a private world of checking and double checking. Backpack secured, check. Headlights in place and turned off, check. Jacket closed, check. Helmet secured, check. As the helicopter arcs towards the ground, a side door opens. The command to go, go, go marks the exit of each team member as they are dropped at speed one by one from 4 feet above the ground. Second later, the helicopter peels away so as not to alert anyone to their position, and the team is running through the darkness to find the injured. So you can see this is a battlefield situation, and this has happened in real life. This is a real story. The team is running through the darkness to find the injured. It is the heat that first hits you and the stench, and the smell of burning flesh is something you never forget. Colonel Pete Mahoney commands the British Army Medical Emergency Response Team, or MERT. They work in small teams under the most difficult of conditions, operating much of the time in a dark helicopter. They have to keep their lights switched off so as not to attract enemy fire. Dropped into battlefields at great pace to treat the injured, they frequently come under intense gunfire as they make their way to the casualties. These teams typically comprise 5 to 6 people, including trauma surgeons, anesthesiasts, nurses, and paramedics, and at least 2 regular soldiers whose job is to protect the medical team. Colonel Pete, a medical consultant, is often the most senior officer in the team and in overall charge. But a different group member will take control of the team at different points in the mission, depending on the nature of the situation. When they are first dropped on the ground, it is the soldiers, not Colonel Pete, it is the soldiers who take the lead. Once the squad finds any casualties, one of the medical staff will then take over command and begin a systematic assessment of the nature of enemies. However, at any time, the security detail can reassert command and order the team out of the area if it is judged to be too dangerous. Once an indication of priority of the casualty is given, the anesthesiast then takes control and decides who can be sedated and brought back to the helicopter and who needs to be treated in situ. All this occurs on a live battlefield, often under heavy fire. These are rapidly moving situations that can change in seconds. Less critically ill patients are allocated for treatment in a specific order, usually on the spot, and one of the nursing staff will typically take responsibility for this. The decision of how and when to bring the injured back to the relative safety of the copter is made by the soldiers, and command at that point is taken over by the helicopter pilot, who decides if it is safe to return and land in the location indicated by the staff on the ground. Then, when they arrive back on the helicopter, bringing with them the most seriously injured victims, a decision often has to be made about whether to operate straight away in the lurching, almost dark of the aircraft, or to wait until they get back to the field hospital. This is taken by Colonel Pete in consultation with another senior medical officer. Now, I read that again because I think it so vividly illustrates what we mean by a hierarchical model. So here we have a live battle situation. You've got different people in different positions, but who is in charge at any given moment is depending upon what's happening in the situation. It might be Colonel Pete, who is the highest ranking officer. But if the soldiers who are leading them decides it's too dangerous, they take over. Now they have to follow the soldiers. They're in charge. They call the helicopter pilot back. If the helicopter pilot says too dangerous, he's in charge. He will decide who gets on and who doesn't get on. There is hierarchy, but there's changing of the hierarchy. It's more fluid based upon the talents, based upon the skills. Do we operate now? The anesthesiologist has to make decisions about who gets one's care. The nurses decides the priority, who goes first, who goes second. You can see it shifts constantly depending upon the situation and their gifts and their training. This is what we mean by a hierarchical model. This is what Kara Myers is saying in her book, Rediscovering Eve, that this is probably the model we should look at, because when we look at the Hebrew text, when we look at ancient Israel, we see that it's not a rigid model that like the patriarchal model, where only the man is in charge, the woman is subservient, and never does she act in leadership over the man. We see in the stories of the scriptures that we've looked at that there were many women who acted with leadership even where other men were concerned, and men followed their leadership, even though it was a male-dominated culture. Were there still hierarchies? Yes. But could women move into different positions because of their need, because of their talent, because of their skill? Yes, we see that with Deborah. We see that with the wise woman of Abel Beth Ma'achah. We see this with the Shunammite woman. We see this with Abigail. All of these women, because Abigail would have been, as the CEO of her household, She went contrary to the orders of her husband and was telling the servants what to do, and they followed her. And of course, many of those servants would have been male servants. So what do we have here? We don't have a, as Carol Mayer says, and I believe her suggestion is correct, that we should call it a heterarchal model. That's what we're seeing, even though there are hierarchies that are still functioning, but they could change in terms of who's in charge based upon the situation, based upon the calling of God, based upon the gifts and the talents that were in operation. This is the egalitarian point of view, not so much a heterarchal model, but that who leads is based upon giftings, not upon gender. And that's the point that Carol Mayers was saying, that often gender would not come into play. And of course, we looked at other scholars, Don C. Benjamin, Victor Matthews, they would also talk about this, that gender would not come into play. There were other things that would come into play to determine who was in a position of leadership. Now, here's the thing. The heterarchal model explains why we see women, even in a male-dominated culture, leading. Now, the heterarchal model does not deny, nor does it eliminate hierarchy, nor does it do away with male leadership. It doesn't do that. But it does challenge, and it does repudiate the complementarian model of men are to always and only lead, women are to only submit to, follow, and nurture male leadership, and they're to never lead. It repudiates what I call the patriarchal principle. And it renders, the heterarchal model renders unnecessary the need to downplay, dilute, and deny female leadership over men or apart from men when we see it in the scriptures. We don't have to deny it. We don't have to downplay it. We don't have to dilute it. We don't have to try to explain it away. If we recognize this is a heterarchal model and it's not eliminating male headship, as some people seem to be afraid, and not headship, I'm sorry, wrong word, male leadership, men could be leaders, women could be leaders. The ideal of God is that they serve together. So it renders unnecessary the need to downplay, dilute, and deny female leadership over men, or even apart from men when we see it in the scripture. And it also shows, the heterarchal model shows that a woman's leadership was not limited to only other women or children, but it included men as well. And again, we see this in the biblical stories. So a heterarchal model makes space for and affirms women's leadership in ancient Israel. Now, a heterarchal model does not mean that there was complete equality, because it was still a male-dominated culture. But we do see women rising to positions of leadership, even over other men, leading other men, and doing it successfully, doing it fruitfully, doing it with God's blessing. And when we go, well, how is it? Well, if we say simply it's a patriarchal model that's in play, it leaves some questions as to how these women are functioning. But if we say it's a heterarchal model, that explains it. Okay, so I think a heterarchal model better explains why women could function in these male-dominated society, and why men would not have a problem with it. Because again, when you look at all of these stories where women are positions of leadership, we see no complaints from men. We see none whatsoever. Okay, so these are the last three that I wanted to share with you. These are the key learnings and findings that we've studied thus far in our exploration of women and men in biblical and cultural context in ancient Israel in the Hebrew scripture. Reading these texts in the cultural and historical context in which they were written yields greater insight into and a greater understanding of the biblical text itself. And it also helps us to have a greater understanding of God's original intent for men and women and how they are to live, work, and function together. So this is why we spent 37 messages going into great depth and detail where this was concerned. So we're finished with the Old Testament part of our series, and we're going to be moving into the New Testament now and looking at these same issues and some other issues, again, in their historical, cultural context. However, we're not going to start next week. We're going to be starting this in June. You're like, wait, Mike, June? What about May? Well, here's what we're going to do. In a few weeks, we're going to resume our study of Who's the Boss. But what we're going to be doing next week, if everything goes well, I will be presenting an interview that I'm going to have with Dr. Nijay Gupta. That's going to be playing here instead of me teaching. I'm going to be interviewing him this week, Lord willing, if everything goes well. And I'm going to play that interview. We're going to be talking about his book, his new book that just came out, Tell Her Story. We're going to be talking about, put this out here. We're going to be talking about this book. I'm going to be asking him some questions. I've been formulating the questions over the past few days. And I've been looking at different interviews that he's already done and tried to bring out some other things that I think would be very helpful, not just repeating the same thing over and over. So Dr. Gupta, if you're watching this, I will get those questions to you by this weekend. But I've been formulating questions, and I think it's going to be a great interview. That's going to be the interview. I will be interviewing him this week. I will be playing the interview next week. And then in the month of May, May is Mental Health Month. The month of May is Mental Health Month. So what Karen and I decided was that we are going to be doing messages that deal with mental and emotional health for the month of May. So I'm going to be presenting a message or two. Hopefully I'm going to be interviewing some people, some scholars where this is concerned. The plan is to have my wife, Karen, also present a message that deals with mental and emotional health. So we're going to be doing that the entire month of May. So this is why we're going to restart and resume Who's the Boss in June. All right. But during the month of May, it's Mental Health Month. And I think because of the research that Karen and I both have been looking at and everything that's been going on with people, the increase in depression and anxiety, we thought we want to speak to that and address that from a Christian perspective. And of course, you know, with me, bringing in history, culture, language, neuroscience, latest science and psychology and to arm you with information that I thought would be beneficial to you. So we're going to be doing that in the month of May. All right. So in a few weeks, or I should say in June, we will be resuming the story, Who's the Boss? Men and men in biblical and cultural context. That'll be the New Testament portion that we will begin in June. But next week, Lord willing, when you come here, you will be seeing an interview of me with Dr. Nijay Gupta as we talk about his book, Tell Her Story. All right. Hope this was a blessing to you. If you enjoyed this, please tell someone else about this. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your dog, okay? And have them watch this. This will be uploaded to our YouTube channel called KIC TV, Keeping It in Context TV. And I usually upload it as soon as the message is over. So at least within the next hour or two, you'll have the message on the website. Excuse me, not the website, you'll have the message on the YouTube channel. And so direct your friends there to watch it. If you're watching this on the channel and you like what you are hearing, please hit the subscribe button. That helps the algorithm. Please hit the like button. That also helps the algorithm. And it lets people, it helps us to get the message out to more people. So this is Mike Davis saying thank you so much for being with me in this study as we've recapped, we're finished the recap now, of our Old Testament teaching concerning who's the boss, women and men in biblical and cultural context. Lord willing, I will see you next week. Everybody have a great weekend and have a great week. Bye-bye.